founding. And we're really delighted that in the last years, we have brought about this partnership with the University of Winchester and their Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and also OxPeace. It's been a fantastic collaboration. And if this is your first time, very briefly about who we are. So Embrace Dialogue is a Colombian peace-building organization promoting the culture of dialogue. In a few moments, Andre, who I'll also introduce, will tell you a little bit more about what the culture of dialogue means to us. But in terms of our work, we are involved in different aspects of peace building. We do work in Colombia, for example, peace pedagogy and youth-led practices. And also on a global level, we do dialogue such as this one. And we try to think about how the learnings from Colombia and our work can be applied to other places around the world. And at the same time, we're always really, really keen to learn from other people and bring those learnings back to Colombia. So, like I said before, we're always glad to see when an international crowd appears in dialogues such as this one or events such as this one. So if you'd like, if you're comfortable doing so, please let us know maybe in the comments on Zoom or on YouTube if you're watching the live stream where you are logging on in from. But yeah, so back to the dialogue today. No matter how difficult reconciliation might be to define, so the word itself, it is really at the center of our work in RED, and these critical dialogues are really important for us, therefore. And through this series of events, we will continue inviting practitioners, academics, decision makers to share their research and activities around reconciliation processes. In the chat box of the Zoom, I will post links to where you can subscribe to our newsletter, follow our work, and also videos to all the previous critical dialogues, which are on our YouTube channel. So you can also watch the previous ones. And you can rewatch this one if you are really gonna love it. So yeah, once again, on behalf of Embrace Dialogue, the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, welcome. I am now handing over to Dr. Andres Gomez-Suarez, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, and co-founder of Rodeemos el Diálogo, who will convene today's dialogue and also introduce today's special guest. Andre?
Thank you, Lucia. Thanks so much for that. And I'm delighted to be here. And thanks so much, Colette, for accepting this invitation. It's so good to see people who have been in previous dialogues here. That's great, but also to see new people. The idea of this series is that we know that dialogue doesn't take place in one single meeting. So the idea is that dialogue unfolds. For that reason, we really want to invite you to continue coming to this series of dialogues to try to bring ideas together. And the reason why we have this partnership with Rodeemos el Diálogo at the University of Winchester is because Rodeemos el Diálogo has 6 principles that are really important to build a culture of dialogue. And those principles are the principles that would be very, very important for all of us today to embrace so that we can follow them. And so let me just share with you those principles, in particular with the people who are new to this series. So the first principle is generosity. We invite you to be fully present in this space. The second principle is honesty. We hope that you can share your doubts and your assumptions. The third principle is co-responsibility. We invite you to hold this space together. The fourth principle is respect. We invite you to listen to what other people think and see your own assumptions and prejudices probably coming and suspending them so that you can nurture all. The fifth principle that we have is solidarity, so that we can develop empathy and put ourselves in the shoes of others. And the final principle is self-criticism. So we invite you to nurture intellectual humility and probably find ways to learn something new in this space. So with those principles that we're gonna try to keep and embrace today, I just would like to say that we understand dialogue as a horizontal transformative process, which gets closer to David Bohm's idea. According to him, dialogue is a stream of meaning flowing among and through and between us. So the invitation in this space is to leave aside the old patterns of interaction. This is not a seminar. This is a space of spontaneity for us to think together and see our individual patterns of thought and our inconsistencies in those thought processes. So what is going to be the structure of today's seminar? Dialogue. The first part, Colette and I are going to engage in a dialogue. We are going to talk for about 25 minutes. We ask you please not to use the chat option in the Zoom. We want you to try to focus on what we are saying and thinking about your own thought process going on. And then after those 25 minutes, we want to open the space. And in that moment that we open the space, we would like to hear. We want to hear what you have been thinking. We would like to hear what are the ideas that come into your mind. We would like to hear your questions that you might have. And then we will hear 3 or 4 of those ideas, interventions, questions, and then we will come back to see where Colette's thought is going and where mine is going. And then we will go back to you. We will do another round of collecting thoughts and ideas. And then we will come back and then we might do another one depending on how long we take to share our ideas and comments together. And then by 5:30 UK time, we will be wrapping up and I will try to do a short comment on the food for thought that has been left for all of us to continue thinking within ourselves about the ideas that have been shared in this space. As Lucia has said, please remember that this space is being live streamed. So when you are going to talk, when we invite you to voice and to participate in the dialogue, you will be recorded. And so we hope that that's okay with you. So without further ado, let me introduce and welcome our very, very, very special guest to this 12th critical dialogue on reconciliation, Colette Rausch. Colette is a research professor at the Mary Hock Center for Reconciliation at the Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution of George Mason University. Her current focus is exploring how trauma affects reconciliation. She was previously with the US Institute of Peace, UCIP, where she held multiple leadership roles, including founding its Neuroscience and Peace-Building Initiative and leading the development of new approaches, research, and tools, including Justice and Security Dialogue, a pioneering initiative to build trust between local communities and police. Prior to UCIP, Colette held senior human rights and rule of law positions with the mission in Kosovo of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She served the US Department of Justice as legal advisor in Bosnia and Hungary and as program manager for Central and East Europe. And she served as a federal prosecutor and public defender. Colette has over 20 years of working in the fields of peace building, justice, security, and rule of law and trauma transformation. She has directed or participated in missions and projects in more than 2,000 countries, including Afghanistan, Guatemala, Iraq, Kosovo, Liberia, Libya, Myanmar, Nepal, Nicaragua, Peru, Senegal, and Yemen. Colette is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and books on topics including fostering peace-building processes in conflict-affected societies, strengthening justice, security, and rule of law in transitional societies, and addressing reconciliation and transitional justice. And she, in particular, this is very important for today, and she is the editor of Neuropeace, a 3-volume publication of essays and articles exploring the link between neuroscience and peace building, published in 2021. So with that incredible sort of expertise of Colette, I think we can kick this dialogue off, asking you a really important question for this, to set the ground. And is, Colette, how recent is the use of neuroscience in peace building, and what have we learned so far?
Thank you, Andre. And first, I deeply appreciate being part of this dialogue, and I especially appreciate the principles that you set forth and the focus on dialogue, because already that's incorporating aspects of neuroscience into how we approach reconciliation. So I love this format. I'm so happy it's not the traditional kind of seminar. And this is just a wonderful, wonderful forum. So I would say when I talk about neuroscience and peace building as integrating knowledge between the two, I look at it more as the many facets of neuroscience, kind of the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary aspect, as well as in peace building, many, many different ways of peace building, dialogues, peace processes, transitional justice, reconciliation processes, and how we can work at this intersection from many different framings, from both practice to academia, and different ways we approach it. So if you in looking at how long it's been kind of in the forefront, I would say there's definitely been pieces for many, many decades. For example, in social psychology, they've been working on research and practice at the intersection of intergroup conflict. And if you look at years within the peace building field, the aspect of trauma and mental health and psychosocial support and how we integrate that into peace processes has been work of practitioners and academics for many, many years. And I'd even say, even if we don't frame it this way, here in the US and in other fora, there are indigenous communities which have been addressing issues that we could say has aspects of neuroscience when it comes to healing and bringing communities together. There's wisdom that's been around for millennia. So what I look at is when have we made an intentional effort or focus of bringing in this knowledge that's been around for millennia, knowledge that's in science, knowledge from social science, the new research that's ongoing on the brain, scans of the brain, the circuitry of the brain, the mind and the body, and the neurobiology of our reactions to each other. How are we synthesizing all of this knowledge, learned, experiential, academic practice? How are we bringing that and engaging together across policy practitioners? And how are we bringing in what's considered knowledge and valid knowledge? So I know that's kind of a big way of kind of focusing, but that I would say is fairly recent. There's organizations like Beyond Conflict in Boston, Massachusetts. There's universities all around the world who are engaging in this. There's a lot of pioneering work being done in different places. And what I think is needed in the moving forward is it's more intentional, that we're looking at it as integrating more intentionally and really grappling with these hard issues rather than pieces of it or working at cross purposes.
And since we've been thinking a bit about this link between neuroscience and reconciliation, and you have somehow explained this broad approach in which you are thinking about the interconnection between different ways in which science and communities have engaged with, and our understanding of the brain and the connection between the mind and the body. A question that comes to my mind, and we usually think about here, is what do you understand by reconciliation? I mean, let's move into just a broad definition of reconciliation that you use in order to then think about the linkages between both.
Yeah, well, that is a deep question. And I think what I might do is, rather than define reconciliation, in a specific technical way, I might do it from more of like a human way of how do we, when we have all of these divisions or polarization or disputes, conflicts with each other as human beings, whether it's individual or group? How do we in some way come together? And at a minimum, I think in the peace building field, that we're not creating violence. How are we preventing violence so we don't spiral into violent conflict, political violence, civil wars? But moreover, how do we transform our relationships with each other? And we can talk a little bit about this later. What are some of the neurobiological and neuroscience-based things that make it difficult as humans to do this? We can talk about that, and that's what I'm so fascinated about. But how can we understand those impediments to us getting along, and how do we then transform those relationships? And not just for peace or to get along, but how do we transform injustice? How do we transform hierarchies of power and who has value and who does not? How do we transform some of these systems that are in place so that we are also avoiding drivers of conflict? But more than that, how are we moving together as humans where we're dealing more with kind of equal relationships, and that sometimes are driving the conflict, if that makes sense?
That's great, because it makes me think a lot about the conversations that sometimes we have with Simon Keyes at the University of Winchester, when he keeps constantly saying that sometimes lately there are these big debates on reconciliation studies in which, how do we define reconciliation? And you bring all these different aspects, and sometimes that idea of mending relationships get sort of lost in the middle of really overarching approaches to peace building. But I think starting with this idea that you have said is mending relations, and then we have to look into the connections with getting beyond injustices, and all of this is precisely something that we discuss in one of the critical dialogues on reconciliation with Conciliation Resources, and with Rachel Clark, who wrote an article, one of the papers on reconciliation and peace building practice, and is how do we connect this with structural transformations, like create a new social contract so that nurtures social cohesion. But then what is really interesting about our dialogue today is that we are not only thinking about all these sort of, like social technologies that human beings develop, but we are now starting to sort of think about the brain within which this happens, the brain of the individuals within which these possibilities of thinking about transformation happens. And so if you could help us to understand a bit how neuroscience help reconciliation practice, how could you help us understand then, what we now know?
Sure. So I'll use kind of an illustration of, I think, those of us who are in the peace building field, and certainly the work that I had done over the years, whether I was in the criminal justice system and seeing the fallout of breakdown of relationships, whether it be violent crime or other things, and wondering what led to this, what drove this violence, or working in peace building activities where there was violence and there was a conflict, and then we were there working on technical things, I'll say intellectual things, drafting peace agreements, passing laws as a way of, these are the things that are going to fix what had happened and prevent it from moving forward. And each of these things, it felt like those illustrations where you have the big ice, the iceberg illustration, where we were seeing what's on top of the water, the evident, the violence, the divisions, but we kept moving forward without success. Violence cycles continued, peace agreements were broken, reconciliation broke down. And in my criminal justice world, the crime cycles kept happening. There was disparate people. When I was doing death row defense, there were client bases where it was mainly people who didn't have resources. It was African Americans who had the higher rates being placed in certain death row communities. And these were curiosities that I was having, that maybe the world isn't just what we think is logical. We're not just logical people solving logical problems of people. But what was underneath that we kept getting hit was these human dimensions. And this is where I think neuroscience really adds to answer your question. There are things that sometimes we are not aware of. There are certain wirings of our brain, certain things we're wired for survival. And if you look at the human imperative of human beings and mammals is to survive, then the system functions to support that survival. So all of the experiences that we have help inform how to respond in the future. So things that cause us to react in survival, the fight, flight, freeze mechanism, the threats that we feel, we respond to those. So we're kind of bopping through life, responding, sometimes not aware that our responses are not related to what's happening in front of us, but in response to something that happened in the past. And we also sometimes think we're other. You know, when we go into peace processes or reconciliations to study it or to engage as mediation actors or facilitators, that we're not part of the system. We're coming from the outside. But the minute we walk in as human beings, we're part of that system. We walk in with our biases, with our assumptions, with our fears and our buttons that get pushed. So we're now part of that system. And so when I talk about neuroscience, I'm really looking at what can I, as someone in the peace building field, look at what's going on in my own neurobiology. How am I responding to what is going on? How is that impacting what's going on around me? How is my trauma history coloring how I respond? How is the trauma history of those that we're working with? How is that impacted? How is our wiring for slotting and categorizing who's safe and who's not into us and them, this group, that group, in group, out group? How is that coming into play? And how is fear? How is in political violence or in disinformation campaigns that get used to help divide people? When you look in the Balkans and you look in places where it looks like it's a religious conflict or an identity conflict, is it really? Or how are fears and pushing buttons of humans to get them to manipulate into violence? How is that being used and how am I playing a part in it? So it's really, in conclusion, kind of taking a pause for a moment, stepping back into what we think we know in peace building, the technical, which is part of it, but what's going on with us as humans? And what can we learn from neuroscientists who are doing, from the hardcore circuitry research to the practitioners who are doing clinical, which is valid. What can we learn to better understand what is driving? What are we motivated by? How are we making our decisions? So when someone says A, maybe that's not really what's going on in the mediation or the reconciliation discussion. What's really driving the dissension or the inability is B. They're not getting repair. They're feeling hurt. And no matter what you do in a peace agreement, if that's still boiling underneath the surface, it's going to pop up and not be resolved. So it goes back to what you just said, Andre, when I look at repair. Otherwise, if we're not kind of addressing and bringing the iceberg part up for examination and sitting with that, we're not going to be able to repair because we're fixing the wrong thing, so to speak. We're not looking at what's driving it or what we might hit.
So, after listening to you and thinking about at the level that you are working, that is mainly, the people, or at least, let's say, the practitioners, the people working on reconciliation and peace building issues. My question is, have you also used this knowledge on neuroscience and all of this awareness that you are talking about with the conflict parties themselves? Is it useful to bring this conversation, for example, and how do you do it? With people who have suffered horrendous levels of violence by another group, and that probably are not aware of all the functionings of the brain, and probably is a very complicated and sophisticated set of knowledge. So is it possible to do this? And is it useful to do it in a conflict region with the parties involved in the conflict itself, or the parties that are suffering that split, that division?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say is, I'll give a couple of examples. So what I would say is it is possible. And what I would say is it's possible in a way that fits the circumstance and is kind of co-created and co-discussed with those that you're working with. So for example, we were doing a dialogue in Libya and emotions were very, very high. and you could feel it in the room. And I think a lot of us have had this experience. And so it was understanding that dimension and the heightened nervous systems, the heightened tight nervous systems. And so when we are tight and tense and we're in survival mode, lectures are just going to go right over our head. We don't have the capacity to have that kind of cognitive openness or that flexibility to be engaging each other. When I'm in survival mode and I feel you're the threat, this is the time naturally for my system to protect itself. And so when we're asking people to engage in complex strategic planning, this is not the time, or to get over it and reconcile, this is not the time. So meeting folks where they are, there are a couple things that could be done, practically speaking. One is in working with the co-conveners, talking about what might help ease the nervous system in the room. It might be starting out slow. It might be doing certain exercises. All of these are culturally specific. And so you're working with the groups of what works in this community. What are the strengths that you've already got? What are already the reconciliation ways of having the nervous system settle a little bit? What might that look like here? The wisdom's in the room. So can you tap into the already existing wisdom, the things that work, to create a conducive, safer environment for these dialogues? So that's one. And then another one is there's the opportunity to do some orientation. So I've even in certain dialogues done a short segment on the stress response, that how we as human beings respond under stress and how certain triggers can help, and what's the neurobiology of stress and trauma. And then open up a conversation of how does that look like here? What are some of the aspects there, and get the wisdom of the group in that way. So there's ways to engage in it with small parts that don't overload our nervous systems, but provide some spaciousness.
Thank you. I mean, it's so interesting because sometimes once one starts studying a bit more of neuroscience, as you rightly said, we human beings in some conflict-torn regions take decisions and that are intuitive in order to try to create safe spaces, in order to have conversations with what you trigger is empathy. You don't know that what you are doing is probably working that new part of your brain and trying to, sort of trigger that network of different parts of the brain to develop, for empathy to come to the fore. But what you do know is that is creating that safe space, and that space of relaxation and trust is absolutely fundamental to get somewhere. So for example, in the case of Rodeemos el Diálogo, when Rodeemos started in Bogota, the whole idea was, why don't we start with breakfast? We cannot just tell people come and talk about very complex issues. Why don't we just have a hot chocolate and a tamal? And why don't we think that it's not only talking to this, but actually that you are building through food a really important experience of sharing a space. And you're never aware of how that's developing in the brain. But I guess when you have the knowledge of neuroscience, that's what is happening. That you know that you can be more. You have more tools to craft the process, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I kind of look at it as a two-part thing. One is orientation or awareness or education, just having an understanding. And that was really the goal of NeuroPeace, and then also the Think Peace podcast, is just food for thought. Just, curiosity, And then that way, like you mentioned earlier, and how the dialogues work, we can kind of say, wow, I looked back at this dialogue that went south. Now I kind of see what might have happened. And that way you're integrating it in a way that makes sense to you and to those who you're engaging with, and you're co-creating that intervention. So it's just really having awareness and then being curious about how this applies. And for example, on the stress response, each person will have something that will resonate differently with them. For me, it was the aha moment was, oh my goodness, this is the way the nervous system works. You know, when you understand the stress response of how in an ideal world, when something happens that's stressful, and stress is natural, it's how we, you know, get up in the morning to go to work, do things. But sometimes if the stress becomes too much, too fast, too long, our systems get overloaded. And I think with the pandemic and everything going on, we're seeing that, you know, it's a lot on many layers for folks and all of us. And when we're at that threshold of too much, too fast, our body gets in survival mode and we're not able to think as clearly. We're not able to make the best decisions. Our creativity goes offline because the body's like, hey, I'm trying to put you in survival. And we may kind of go in a freeze or, you know, a fight mode. And so finding a way to provide ease in the system to allow the system to come down is where the spot is where we can have more meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
And where reconciliation can have that. It's even in our family systems when we're all heightened. This is not the space to be resolving things, but there needs to be the space. And then ultimately, we need to be, there's certain needs that humans have. And there's a really interesting neuroscientist who looks at why we snap. And we don't want to sometimes acknowledge that we're not these rational thinking, high level brain people, but sometimes we're reacting as humans and, you know, mammals. And biologically, we have certain survival mechanisms that have served us through, you know, generations and generations that are not so helpful in our complex society right now. But until we evolve beyond that, it's what we've got. So there's immediate reactions to certain things like threat of the area where we are. Why, when people cut us off on the road, we may have this immediate want to get them because they came into our space. We have these snap things that happen to us that if we don't find ways to have a space in between, we become reactive. So that's kind of what I'm encouraging, you know, is all of us, when you look at like John Paul Lederach, who talks about conflict transformation, which was so pivotal in our field, to see that it's long-term, that it's a process. It's layering this also, this human aspect, the neuroscience aspect onto these systems to understand what's under the hood, our operating systems.
And what you just said really resonates with us, because one of the things that I think are very problematic, and you just put it in a really clear way, is this liberal assumption that we operate always at the rational level. And it's like this sort of, in a way, I'm going to put it this way, like a stigmatization of finger pointing of emotions as if they were negative. It's something to keep outside of the discussion, you know, just be rational. And somehow that's connected in cognitive science. You know, I am thinking about David Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. You know, when he says that system one is that snap reaction to things, and you create these very shortcut assumptions about things almost intuitively. But we have this system two, that is the deep thinking, that takes really, you know, like a different dimension of the brain to engage with sort of creating equanimity between really important emotions like love, fear, grievance, you know, and at the same time, the rational part of, you know, calculating, long-term planning, and all of these things. And so that means, and I guess this is the second part, so one of the things that we've been thinking in Rodeemos el Diálogo, is the idea of embracing our humanity as something, as you said, imperfect. I mean, we are imperfect human beings, so our mind is not perfect, and imperfections happen all the time. And I guess neuroscience can allow us to see those imperfections in our thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you framed it, Andre, because we tend to value the outside, the skin, the clothes we put on, so to speak, for the outside world. That's organized, that's rational, and stifle as you said, there's stigma against emotions. And in certain cultures and communities or offices, it's even more restrictive. Yet they're happening anyway. So where are they going? Where is that emotion going? And that's where I think we see in reconciliations where the desire, and you'd mentioned the grievance, the desire to be heard, to have that grievance stated, sometimes a lot of us as facilitators feel uncomfortable with that. Oh, we can't have any, let's keep it calm, everybody. There's a discomfort with emotion or conflict. And I think sometimes folks in, peace building, and I'll speak for myself early on, it was like, oh, let's just all get along. Peace building means getting everybody to get together. Not necessarily. Sometimes you have to get the grievances in a titrated, safer space. Because if we use the nervous system as an example, we want to allow space within ourselves and others to address things without overload. So how do we create dialogues that allow this kind of ocean wave, this breathing in and out of activation, like a little bit of activation to kind of get things moving, because that's how we have to break through some of these challenges, and allow some settling. How can we go on the waves rather than overload, crash, breakdown of communications and more trauma? So I also want to mention too, the caution we want to do is exactly what you said earlier. It made me think of if I would, put on the wall, less is more, low is fast. Yet in our field with funding, with demands, we're on treadmills going faster and faster, getting nowhere. Yet there's this impulse to do that. And it's counterintuitive to just slow it down, because you can actually do more, but our systems sometimes push further.
Wow. I mean, my reaction to this was going to be that precisely one of the big problems also that we have on the field is that we think that reconciliation can be measured. So now you have all these barometers, and you keep asking people to show indicators of success, when dialogue is something that, the impact of a dialogue, the transformation that can create in human beings. First, it doesn't happen in the space in which the dialogue is happening, but it happens over a long period of time. I mean, sometimes to realize something new in your brain, that came out probably in this dialogue, it will happen in 2 weeks' time when you relate something that you heard today with something else that happened in another moment. And so is this idea that we have been put into now, that we need to measure reconciliation, or that we need to measure the impact of this, probably allows me to ask you one question before we open the floor to hear what other people are thinking. And is that many people will say, oh, then now that we know all these things about the brain, we can go and manipulate the setting, and we can actually measure that we've been successful. So if that's the case, what are the main risks that you see, or what are the main challenges that you identify on working and bringing this link between neuroscience and reconciliation and peace building practice?
Yes, you named one of them, that when we come into new knowledge, or I'm not going to say new knowledge, when we discover old knowledge, when we discover things like this, it's like a thing that we then want to put back into the same system that hasn't worked to begin with, these kind of rigid indicators, these ways of measuring. So that's one risk. And I think it calls for us to stop, pause that, and rethink what is really happening within the dialogues, and use those as measures rather than creating artificial technical ones. That's one. And related to the technical part, another danger of this is, I think, the ethics of it. And as we know more, and we've seen in the past how knowledge of how humans respond, the fear factor, how that can be used by certain actors in order to stir up grievance and cause groups to go against each other. And so how can, like, social media was an amazing thing to open up and flatten the field for people to engage, yet it can also be used to spread disinformation, cause division. So that's a concern, the ethics of knowledge. And then the third part relates to conversations I've had with a lot of colleagues who get a little nervous about the neuroscience, the science aspect, as if we're all just little robots, subject to our wiring. It's like fatalism. where's the self-determination? Where's the spiritual aspect? Where is the human part of the change? Like, is it the soul, the beyond just the nervous system? And so I think this calls for a lot of discussion around. That's why I talk about multidisciplinary and engaging with some neuroscientists who got so excited to take their research and talk with the peace builders. So can we have these dialogues between all of these groups to really get at some of these challenges and to understand that it's complex? So we need to kind of work on these together. But there are challenges and there are risks. So how do we not ignore those? And how do we head on engage in those?
And I find that so inspiring because, as you rightly said, there are critical voices to some of the ways how this has been developing. And I just keep thinking about, I don't know if you know this fantastic book by Ian McGilchrist, that many people disagree with him, but his idea of the master and his emissary, in which he says that one of the main problems is that the way how we've been mapping the brain relies quite a lot on the way in which the left hemisphere of the brain sees the world and tries to instrumentalize and control the world and sort of simplifies the sacredness of the world and the totality of what happens, because it fragments the world into pieces that can be digested. And so what he says is that, the more we realize that the right hemisphere works in a completely different way, in which instead of trying to control the world is like it's engaged with the totality of things. It cannot really, really cut the world into pieces. Then this really creates a really interesting conversation for people to see what sort of approach to neuroscience they want to take, because this idea that we have a brain split into two hemispheres and that each one does different things seem to be sort of being rejected in the 1990s. But after his book in the 2010, I think, it's been sort of bringing back the debate that probably there is some truth to it, that we still don't understand really well how is it that the brain works, and that all of these advances that we have in neuroscience, well, these are theories. We have still a limited knowledge of how our brain works, and there much remains to be done that can shed light into how is it that we're working to try to make sense of the world and create a more peaceful planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And one just small comment I want to make about that is therein lies the power of it, because there's so much that is not known, and there's so much that needs to be explored in our lifetimes and after. And so I think the power of it is also, one thing that emerges is the neuroplasticity, the resilience of the human body and the brain. So the more one knows, it's not like fatalistic, oh, well, we're just, little robots responding to our wiring. It's much more powerful than that. The agency it provides us with having some general understanding, which is in its baby steps and stages right now, but even with that, allows us to engage with it. Okay, if this is the case, then how might I show up in a way that can not ignore it, some of these kind of not so great human tendencies, but how can that be true? And how can we overcome that? And there was a neuroscientist who talked about, as I mentioned, Why We Snap, the book Why We Snap. He also talked about how humans also have something that other species don't. And it's this ability to come together in really powerful ways for good. How people come together after a tragedy, how communities come together. We have that. So let's look at those strengths and how do we expand that despite and in addition to these other things that are sometimes challenging, our certain human natures. How can we still come together in a much more powerful way?
Great. I think we have enough food for thought. I mean, we engage so much into this that I think, we went a bit over time, but I think it's fantastic because I can see already Eduardo wanting to jump in. So this is the time to start putting your hands up. We will go back to Colette in a while and see where we end up. Eduardo, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Andre. Can you guys hear me well? Fantastic. So thank you, Andre. Thank you, Rodeemos el Diálogo, for opening up this platform once again. Fantastic conversation. Thank you, Colette. I think it's an amazing research and amazing job and work that you're doing. I have 3 questions. You can either ignore them altogether or just choose or answer the 3, whichever you prefer. The first one would be, in your experience, what resources does neuroscience offer when, say, a peace-building landscape questions or challenges someone's strongly held imaginaries? I'm talking about people's convictions, mental resources, maybe thought and affective patterns. Are there any resources that neuroscience can offer when you need to grapple with that specific situation? The second one would be, in that effort to sort of reinterpret, at one point you said that you had to sort of reinterpret other people in terms of what you've discovered in neuroscience. How do you avoid imposing yet another narrative to other people's situation? Is it maybe working only with people that are willing to engage in a neuroscientific inquiry, for example? Or is it just a resource that you have as a practitioner and that you eventually use out there in the field? And then finally, you also talked about interdisciplinarity, which I love. And so in that same spirit, I was wondering, have you spoken or talked with or engaged with people in philosophy working on social imaginaries? I'm bringing it up because it's part of what I do in my doctoral research, but it really resonated with a lot of things that both Andre and you were talking about in terms of being critical with sort of reductionist paradigms or over-rationalizing schemes and being more mindful of one's own emotions, the convictions, personal ways of developing one's identity, and how that has a very direct and relevant impact when engaging in peace-building initiatives. Sorry if I asked too big questions, but yeah, I just had to ask. Thank you.
That's the point. Thank you, Eduardo. Over to Alejandro.
Hi, hi Colette. This was fantastic. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Andre and Lucia and Rodeemos el Diálogo for organizing this fantastic dialogue. So one of the most important markers of victimhood, especially in the context of a civil war, is that the pain and the suffering inflicted on a person are completely undeserved, which can have very significant impacts on the life of a person, just beyond the pain of the victimizing act in itself. It can completely destabilize a person's sense of self and also their belief in a just world. And these traumatic experiences can be channeled, can be coped with in destructive way. Desire for revenge, self-harm, harm to others. And well, these are destructive responses that, of course, do not contribute to peace building. So I wanted to ask Colette, are there methods or strategies that we know or that we have evidence of that help people recover this sense of self in constructive ways and potentially constructive in the context of peace building as well? A couple that come to mind, of course, are community creation, victim activism, and well, you guys were talking about the power of dialogue, the transformative power of dialogue. But I wonder if there are other ways, or if you could say a little bit more about the ways in which victims recover that sense of self. Thank you again.
Thank you, Alejandro. Fantastic. Frances, over to you.
Hi. I was wondering about your perspectives on the link between artistic and cultural activities. Cooking and food was mentioned, but I've seen that a lot when going to kind of community events and how that can really change things when people have been having quite kind of strong dialogues and just that kind of interaction with neuroscience and peace building. And yeah, I would love to hear your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. Rahu, over to you. you're having problems with your microphone. See if you can unmute yourself. Breathe. You're almost there. No, we cannot hear you. We can see you now, but we cannot hear you. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. I really appreciate this conversation too, like everyone has said. It seems like it's the missing piece. I like what you said, Colette. I've been following your work over the last few years. I like how you ended with saying, people can come together after tragedies. And so the question is that that's a hope. That's a beautiful hope. How can we transfer that wisdom to the situation, like, for example, and I just give it an example, is Ukraine. When this war started and people were talking about peace building and mediation and trying to create a settlement, I had a difficult time seeing it happening with everybody so heightened tensions. It didn't seem like there was a space where anybody's neurological systems were all balanced and that they could actually enter and bring something of a solution or any kind of options. And the second part of my question is, in the world today, we see so much of this, what we've talked about, left brain, right brain, typical, atypical people. Now it's being used in the field of autism quite a bit. How do we bring that discussion to the world? Because it seems like people are becoming more autistic or left brain oriented as they are more in conflict prone or they're more into heightened stress situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Mbe, over to you.
Thank you so much for that helpful outline.
Try to put your microphone quite close to your mouth because we cannot hear you well.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
I apologize. Thank you so much, Colette. Given that you know so much about the United States, the question that I'm interested in asking, given the extent to which politicians have used the exploitation and manipulation of fear for political success, does it concern you at all that that has now become part of the armory of political discussion? And when you think about translating that into a conflict or post-conflict situation, people appear to have extraordinary skills, like Trump, at exploiting and manipulating fear. And to what extent do you worry that that skill, the exploitation of fear, is way ahead of what you were saying earlier about managing those fears, about moving against those fears, about slowing those fears? We don't need to look far afield. Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, in the United Kingdom, the Brexit fear of immigrants, all of these political movements have found a way of exploiting and manipulating fear. And I guess from my perspective, I worry that the peace-building community, in a sense, has been left behind because that skill, that exploitation, is now running amok.
Thank you, Mbe. I think we have a lot for the time being. Again, I've seen other hands up. We are going to do a second round. Thank you to all. So Tatiana, I have you first there. Don't put your hand down. And all the rest, please start putting your hands up too. But I think this is a good moment to come back to Colette. The idea is not necessarily to answer all of these questions. And probably I'm going to invite the people who are going to be in the second round also to make comments and share their own thought processes so that we don't end up in a seminar discussion. But I think there is lots of food for thought there. So let me get back to you and see, how you want to respond in general to some of the comments that have been made, or where you're thinking now after what you've been listening to this audience that has been so eager to talk to you. And then, we take it from there and do another round. And probably I also add a couple of things that I've been thinking after some of the things that were put on the table. So over to you, Colette.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for those questions. These are really deep questions, and questions that hit right at the heart of the issues and the challenges. And there are a couple themes that came up as I was listening to the questions. And so I thought what I'd first of all do is kind of, in the way I synthesized the thrust of the questions collectively, and then a response that I have. And then I would love to get other folks' thoughts, because you could have this would be lovely, literally, to take these questions and have all of us in a group and bring in some of the neuroscientists. And this would be an incredible dialogue around these questions to get with collective wisdom, because these are really for our times. So to start out with, the questions related to strongly held convictions. And I will also look at it as, the pain and suffering, where we can get stuck in the pain, and then how that might come out in a destructive way. So I'd say with those, my experience in what some of the science is indicating is going head at it and countering is not the way. Those of us in the US who have family members to what MB said, who have family members who have been pulled into certain belief systems, science and neuroscience will say just telling them they're wrong or giving them facts is not going to work. So it's almost as if, and from a neurobiological standpoint, going to the victimhood, if I'm hurt, and especially with what Alejandro, you mentioned, when it relates to destabilization of self, or ways of looking at the just world where things came upon you that you had no role in, we can look at a lot of that is this moral injury and things kind of being upset with the way our whole way of viewing is like a direct blow. And that's sometimes the hardest for human beings to overcome. So we need to let people have those. We need to be able to let people have that and not force people or counter them or talk them out of it. And that's where it goes to how we might engage when this is present. How do we as peace builders engage with the pain and suffering? How do we engage with thought patterns that, are not conducive to peace building? I think it's almost like we have to meet people where they are. And you cannot override it. We cannot somehow force it down the road. It's like on a train track, we got to get on the other track and walk with them. And what they talk about firmly held beliefs, all that one can do is hold space. It sounds kind of corny, but and it can be hard. You can be totally opposed to that statement that someone made, like, that we're opposed to their political view or how they see the world. But if we can hold the space that we can have that space and compassion, and maybe talk about a different way of looking, not countering, but a different path or a different way. Neuroscience will talk about that can sometimes be an opening where you're not hitting them directly. You're just giving them a little bit of a thought over here on this track that gives food for thought, but with kind of compassion and not countering. And then honestly, we all have to come along our own path. It may be months, years, we may never. And we have to be okay with that. So I think in the peace building field, to conclude on that part, and then I have a comment on the last one, we can't fix things. We can't make it nice and tidy. We can't force the train down the track. We have to just kind of walk with it, meet people where they are, and then be willing to hold that space and allow some maybe other ways of thinking. This gets to something Francis said. There's research around the power of culture around rituals, whether it's food or prayer or however we engage. And so this again goes to meeting people where they are and building on the strengths. What are the strengths that we all have? And where can we strengthen those dialogues and interactions around these rituals that are already in place in communities and societies, instead of coming in externally and trying to impose something. It's just not, that's not it. It's walking alongside and co-learning and co-creating together. And then the last comment is, oh my goodness, this is huge about the use of fear in the political environment. And absolutely, when I started to see in the US what was happening with the election in 2016, but I'll say this was happening 10 years before. What happened in 2016 elections was just like a big bright light on it. We had been edging into this, like other countries that we see over in the countries in which we work. It doesn't happen overnight. You see a slippage. You see with Nazi Germany, it was a slippage. You see when working in the Balkans over a decade period of time, it was a slippage that then a flashpoint. So if you look at the slippage and then the 2016 elections, the peace building field was definitely on the back foot. This was kind of a shock. And so I don't have an answer for how. I do feel like the way we're wired, we lend towards the survival. We lend towards it's easier to get the fear going. All of this is like the momentum. So I look at it to us, the best I could come up with is what can we individually do to keep our system not caught up in the whirlwind. Like if you look at the tide pools, can we stay outside and not be a part of it? And then what can we do in our immediate environment, within our families, with those we work? And can you create enough of a momentum of collectivity that you push against that? And I was just talking with a neuroscientist yesterday, and they were talking about sometimes people want to go on their holes and kind of don't want to be part of it, but then that allows the whirlwind to get stronger of those people who are pulling people into the vortex of fear and hate and division. So we do have obligations to counter that. Not directly, I don't mean like fighting, but to create another pathway to try to pull the tide over this way. Yeah, and yeah.
Sorry, Colleen, I thought you were.
No, I was complete. I just realized, Raju had mentioned something that relates to this. Is we also have to acknowledge that, especially, it was interesting when you mentioned the autism. There's research now that is really coming out in a way that is people are starting to recognize the how autism and the way our brains think and how we process. Sometimes there's masking and overloading. And so we try to respond in ways that are consistent with what society wants. And so this is a whole nother frontier of how do we start engaging with different even brains and thought processes. It used to be like Venus and Mars with men and women. And now, you know, the part with, we have many different ways how we look at gender, and we look at many different ways of how we look at, you know, people who are more scientific in the way they're thinking, and then those who are more, you know, in the social sciences might look another way. We have to find ways to talk and communicate with brains that are functioning a different way. There is no mean. We're assuming that there's a mean, and we just have to get there, and anybody else who doesn't think that way is outside the mean. In reality, there's many different ways of thinking. So how in peace building do we not just assume we're all thinking the same way when we're processing and doing things in different ways?
And I think that's so important, Colleen, because I guess one of the main concerns sometimes when we rely on this idea of snap reactions, you know, or when we're thinking that, oh, we all react to survival in a similar way, that is an aggressive way of protecting ourselves, we construct that as a truth. Probably is the norm in the subjects that have been studied, but I don't think necessarily the response to aggression is aggression. But I think, and when we think about, you know, like this idea that the media that controls most of the Western world today has been shaped by a very particular way of thinking that relies on these things that have been revealed as truth. So they trigger and they report more on the negative, on the fear of the terrorist, on the fear of, you know, of the other, because the brains automatically are working within that environment because they have been shaped in that direction in this particular part of the world. But there can be alternative responses to that, but they don't focus on that. There is not enough reporting on people who actually reporting on peace building, for example. That doesn't sell, that is not as appealing. And it's also because then if we are thinking in the whole idea that the brain, that we have system 1 and system 2, to the reaction to reconciliation requires a far more, it is deeper engagement with yourself and with your emotions, and it implies contemplation, implies equanimity, implies a different way of it implies time. And it made me think about this. One of the most inspiring examples that I saw, and that in Colombia probably is not even well known, but one of the most inspiring examples of reconciliation was this mother who her son had been disappeared. 2 or 3 of her sons had been disappeared by paramilitary groups. And she started searching for them, and she never found them, but she found the perpetrator. And people constantly say, poor victims, that when they see their perpetrators that don't go to jail. But when I think about her reaction was the total opposite. She did something. Her brain did something that was totally unexpected. She heard his story of why he had become a perpetrator. He actually told her how he had participated in the disappearance of her son. He cried and apologized for it by his own decision. And she said that the only way she would forgive him is if he decided to be her son. So she adopted him. I mean, that is a brain showing that we don't respond to aggression with aggression. And that is in those unexpected reactions of human brains that we can find solutions to Ukraine. But the problem is that we're trapped within some frameworks that we think are eternal truths, like justice, for example. Justice has been created in our brains. And the whole idea that there is this fair proceeding that needs to take place, it is a particular creation of our brain. And of course, it's very difficult to have these discussions because in a world in which we want to search for accountability and we want to send people to jail and we want to stop gross human rights violations, it's very difficult to say, well, it's not the only way. There are other ways. And we're having very deep and complex discussions nowadays in Colombia of how to engage with criminal actors in peace processes, whether they deserve a different system than the criminal justice system. But all of these discussions are happening in our brains. Anyway, let me leave it like that. Let's open the floor for another round of questions because I see 2 hands and probably there will be more hands. And then we come back to you and we continue in this stream of shared meaning flowing between and through us. So Lucia, over to you.
Tatiana was first, so let her go.
Go ahead, no problem.
Tatiana, over to you.
Okay. Yes, I think that I have a question because when you were talking about like the importance to create like a safe space for reconciliation and how to manage a stress response, I was thinking like how we can apply or connect with neuroscience and reconciliation for different kind of victims. I was thinking, for instance, like human rights defenders who are like, usually they are victims as well. And they are, and I don't know, they have like a process of healing and then they are trying to support peace as well and try to defend others. So how is this process? I was thinking as well about children, for instance, how to create when they are victims as well, how to create like this safe space for them. I was thinking as well about the importance of digital violence. For instance, it's like how to connect neuroscience and reconciliation, because I think that social media is a space to, when we can come together, like it's also a space to talk and express some knowledge, thoughts in general, but it's also a space to create violence. So it's like how we are behaving offline and online. So yeah, I had some ideas.
Thank you, Tatiana. Lucia, and please, other people, you know, this is going to be probably the last chance, and it would be lovely to have more voices in this stream of meaning. So if there is someone else who would like to bring more things to the table after Lucia, please, this is a good opportunity to start putting your hands up. Lucia, over to you.
Thanks so much. I at some point during either your conversation right at the beginning or someone else said something, I thought of something that Paul Dolan, who's I think a professor, maybe not anymore at LSE, once said in a talk. He said, fool yourself that you have free will, but don't fool yourself that others do. I think it was probably when we were talking about the determinism of like kind of thinking, well, this is how our brain works. So I guess if we have a faulty brain, then there's no hope for us to change. And I really like that thought, because I think it's the duplicity of both understanding that people work in a certain way and therefore maybe having an easier time of showing forgiveness or coming closer to them, because you understand that some things are automatic and some things are affected by how we grew up, the situations we were put in. But at the same time, having this hope of understanding perhaps the opportunities of neuroplasticity, in the sense that we know that how we feel or see the world right now does not have to be how we feel or see the world in the future, that there is opportunities for us to change that. And he didn't mean it in that context, but it's how I sort of reimagined that thought. And also, when Tatiana was now talking about related to what MB said before, with the media and the news and how it affects us and how it creates, how there can be uses and misuses, right, of the understanding and the knowledge of neuroscience. And I always felt that in psychology, whenever we would study something in my undergrad, like there was an awareness that all this incredible understanding of how humans work is probably well known in the military for years. It's just now sort of ethically being introduced in academia, and that's a frightening thought. But I think I see real value in people who care also having this understanding and this knowledge. And with Tatiana talking about sort of digital peace building and digital violence, I know how, like, when I want to react in an impulsive or angry way, how the people I'm around with can really change my response by giving me a pause or giving me a prompt. And I was wondering how great social media could be if the AI would be used to analyze what the messaging is looking like, and when it gets angry, send you little prompts suggesting, to maybe take a breather, or like help you to put yourself in the shoes of the other before responding to an angry message. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Lucia. That's great. Thank you. Eddie, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm a complete amateur in the field of neuroscience, but I've been taking a course, an online course that the New Scientist magazine has made available, which is very useful. I just thought I'd share a couple of insights that might be helpful. One is, one of the presenters said something that I thought was very acute. He said that the brain is very bad at creating an accurate picture of the world, but it's very good at creating a useful picture of the world. Right. So we choose what is useful to us. That's sort of hardwired in us. And the other thing that I thought was really fascinating was that the brain learns by sort of creating stories of the world that it then tests out through a sort of feedback loop. And because in a previous life, I was a professional storyteller, I thought that might explain why stories are so powerful as a means of people connecting and disconnecting. So coming to MB's point about, why the bad guys are kind of ahead of the game, I think it's because they have found a way of telling very powerful stories that, of course, are kind of partial. And if we want to get better at this, we need to tell better, more powerful stories.
That's great. I'm so sorry that my wife is not here because she's so much looking into storytelling. And now she actually went to one of these conferences in the US. She's an anthropologist. And instead of giving a paper, she gave a story. So she would be delighted if you could, write a message internally and we could get in touch. This would be great, right? Because actually we've been thinking a lot about storytelling, and actually precisely yesterday in our seminar at the University of Winchester on reconciliation and theories and dynamics of reconciliation, we were talking about storytelling. So it's great to have you here, Eddie, and I hope that this contribution allows us to keep connected and working on something together. That's brilliant.
Right, thank you. And sorry, just one last thing. There's a neuroscientist called Lisa Barrett Feldman, who's written a very interesting book saying how emotions are made, and that we learn to ascribe physical feelings to certain emotions. So this suggests that culture is actually not just a sort of suit of clothes that we put on, but is actually hardwired in us as well if we grew up in a particular culture. So this is why it's very difficult for certain cultures to accept the viewpoint of other cultures, because the whole thing is wrapped up in stories about how we work.
I think her book is called The Social Construction of Emotions, isn't it?
How
emotions are social constructed or something like that.
How emotions are made, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Eddie. That's brilliant. Okay. Well, if no one else is willing to jump in and add something else, we probably would just go back to Colette to see where she is at this moment, what she's been thinking, what ideas she wants to share, and then we will start moving slowly towards the end of our dialogue. So, Colette, over to you.
Yeah, I love the questions in the comments, and Eddie talking about emotions and storytelling and us getting better at using that is very powerful. And because if it goes back to meeting us where we are and what resonates, and emotion and storytelling resonates. So I love that, a kind of a call to action. And then Tatiana, when you were talking about creating safer spaces, there's with children, with victims, with human rights defenders, a couple components of it. There's a lot out there that will talk about trauma informed or trauma awareness. You'll see schools adopt this in nursing, and you'll see some of this in peace building. So there's certain principles that I think are worth us looking at and seeing what resonates. And then, of course, when we're going into an environment, testing out what is comfortable for culturally and individually, because it needs to be tailored. For example, there was one group I worked with where there was no talking about emotions or talking about things that would not have been trauma informed, because where they were is not wanting to engage, and that has to be honored. And so it might have just been simple. They just wanted to be able to have coffee and tea and sit and get comfortable with the folks in the dialogue. That was enough. So I think it's also understanding, even if all these big things for trauma informed is do this, like pause. Shh. These are the principles and ideas, yet what is the right thing for this individual or this person? And boy, social media, I don't know how much of you were on Twitter or going through that. I just want to use a story of being on Twitter. I like Twitter because it's kind of how I can scan what's going on. And I was noticing with the increased chaos and agitation in the system, the Twitter system, I was pinging off of that. Human beings ping. If you notice when you walk into an environment or you meet someone, your body and your system is pinging. gauging. You may not even be aware of it. We may not be aware of it. We're testing. Is it safe? What's going on? How do I need to respond? What's going on in here? We do that. And so it's very agitated. And then there's a new platform called Mastodon that I popped over there just to check it out. And I was checking my system and it had a whole different reaction because they have rules set in place in certain things because they want to keep it in a certain safer space. Now there's criticism that then people can have free discussion, yet I want to point out that there may be things where we have a right to do free speech in certain things, a right to say, a right to do. But the question is that a helpful thing at this moment, looking at it neurobiologically, or is it adding more in this system? So that's where I think social media and a lot of these things going fast in comments, it's just play around with it and look at how we get drawn into it. Next thing you know, you're ready to fight on Twitter. Like, whoa, what just happened there? So I think if we play around with that, with our own systems and how we respond to certain people, certain groups, we're already getting mindfulness around that. That helps us when we're looking at safer spaces. And then the last thing I'll say on that is how we choose what to engage in, who we engage in, and how we do it is powerful for our systems and our ability to be present and be in a space for peace building too. Because our systems with the ever fast environment and the fast of everything, it's speeding up our nervous system. So the more we're aware of that, the more we can titrate ourselves and our systems and engage and provide more options for us to be a safer person to be around in dialogues.
On that note, Colette, and Rahu just wrote a question on the chat because we know that he's been having a bit of problems with the camera and the microphone, but he put this question that allows me to probably ask one final question or just put one more thought on the table before we wrap up. And he says that country leaders don't have the political or moral will for peace. Is that because leaders are in survival mode? I would say not necessarily all of the leaders, but probably that question of whether the leaders who do not have the will for peace is because they are in survival mode and they don't, they are not in a different one, which allows me to say, isn't it a trap to think a lot about what we are thinking from a cognitive dimension, like in trying to rationalize our response to conflict? Shouldn't we be working more on, for example, contemplative practices? I mean, I keep thinking that in my class, we have one of my students is a Zen Buddhist, and she keeps bringing Thich Nhat Hanh to the conversations that we are having. And I keep thinking about all the theories that I share, like theories that are mainly Western theories. Of course, we are in a UK university. We are talking about science, you know what I mean? It's like mainly this science where things can be, sort of seen objectively. And I keep sort of living this tension of thinking, whoa, Taoism has found the answers to all of these rationalization of things 3,000 years ago from a completely different perspective. Less is more, as you were saying, like the Tao that is being named is not a real Tao. So you know that in reality, it's like, so the more we seem to rationalize, to try to find the rational solution to the problem of conflict that allows us to minimize conflict, the more we're moving away, thinking that we can do this step-by-step solution, the more we move away from a different part of our brain that doesn't engage in that way with the world, which brings me back to this idea of, like the more like the right hemisphere of the brain that actually engages with poetry, for example, that engages with music, that engages with this thing that cannot be narrowed down to specific things. So are we trapped in there when probably don't we have that risk a bit in the way how neuroscience has been carried out that take us down that line of.
Yes, and what came to my mind when you were saying it is yes and. So I think there's a place for both, in that for some of us, especially as you said in the UK or in the US, or people are coming, like my relatives who are from the sciences, physics and engineering, we need to welcome that may be the doorway, because it's a safe, it's intellectual and thinking and frameworks is what allows them to get into the other, the contemplative. That, you know, it's like a doorway. So I think both need to be there, and our brain as a muscle and our body as a system, it can engage with both. It's how do we strengthen, in my mind, the mindful contemplative, how do we stretch that muscle and not get lost in trying to put it all in a linear when we know when the world isn't like that. Does that make sense? It's kind of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's finding the right balance between both, I guess. Huh?
Yeah.
So, Colette, on that note, allow me just to bring this incredible dialogue to an end. I think it's been, for the last hour and a half, I've seen so much engagement. I'm pretty sure that some of the people who haven't spoken have been also on the other side of the screen, even though I cannot see them, just going through this mental process and emotional process. I've been feeling my heart pumping more blood in particular moments of our dialogue. I've been sweating in some moments when I've been listening to things. I've been engaged with my imagination in different ways. I think, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to try to create a stream of meaning with these 35 people who have joined us today. Thank you to everyone for bringing your questions, your comments. If I could say that at least there are things that resonate with me, and I think are the food for thought that is going to continue reverberate in my brain is, first, I think it's long overdue the need of peace builders to have at least a bit of some neuroscience training. I think it's really important to think, and I think you have called our attention to that, have an understanding of how the brain works, at least at the basic level, is really important. And it's really important because then you can be aware of your own flaws as a practitioner. More than thinking that you are going to go and do things to people on the ground, is how am I reacting to the things that are happening on the ground in the work that I'm trying to do. That is a work that is trying to bring good to the world. So I think that's the first really, really important thing that I would like to continue thinking about, and which is really important. I think the second thing that has been brought to our attention today is that dialogue, spaces of dialogue. Everyone talks about dialogue being the solution, but finding and creating and nurturing and shaping those spaces of trust is not easy. And really, when you have more understanding of how the brain in general operates and works and how it's connected to physical things and to words and to language, then you can also think about how to design those spaces, how to make them more secure, and how to actually bring about dialogue in a transformative way, moving away from short-term solutions to conflict, because these things take a long time. And the beautiful thing of relying on neuroscience, or what we have learned from neuroscience, is that the brain can rewire, that neuroplasticity is part of the brain, which brings me to the third point that I would like to just put on the table, that at least I'm going to take with me for a while, and is that, we keep thinking when we study reconciliation and we work on reconciliation processes, that truth is absolutely important and fundamental, that justice is absolutely important and fundamental, that the conflicts are about identity, that the conflicts, and sometimes, and that, the trauma of the past cannot be overcome, and that we have to be fixed into the future. But we essentialize so many things as if we take them for granted, and we don't see how these things are the creations of our brains. And that, of course, depending on the historical, geographical context, different brains create different concepts to deal with reality and to survive. And I think like being aware of that allows to see our role in this planet as imperfect human beings who try to contribute and to find new tools to work on reconciliation. So this makes us more humble and invites us to explore new areas of research to try to work on reconciliation. So with that in mind, I would like to ask everyone to give you and all of you a round of applause, to turn your microphones on and turn your cameras on if you can, and to thank you for this great opportunity. And I hope that everyone else continues to be tuned to the next Critical Dialogues on Reconciliation, in which we will be trying to talk with someone else about the important link between reconciliation and the world that we live in.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And we end the live streaming, Tatiana.